demonstration by Professor Bill Garvin from Drury University. We're very pleased to have him here. He's been very kind to come up and educate us a little about the early history of the printing technology. And his topic is something like typecasters and punches, casters,
matrices, and yes, typecasting
in the 15th to 18th centuries. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Garvin here.
I hope we don't blow a fuse or anything. Okay. Yeah. There we go. It's humming again.
Okay.
So on.
You're humming too, Elaine? Good. Oh, that's good. Watch your head there. Your lamp is right above you. It's a technical operation here.
Yeah, this is a lead pot. It's a Lee Loader lead pot. We're not going to be casting any fishing weights or bullets or anything, but I'm going to let it, you get to cast something fun, don't worry. But I'm going to let it, I've got it turned on, I'll let it heat up, and I hope by the time, here in about 30 minutes maybe, that'll be ready to go and we can actually do a typecasting demonstration. And what I'd like to do is I hope at the end of this, a friend of mine told me, that's been here before, told me that the usual format is a person gives a lecture, reads a paper or something, and then there's a spirited discussion afterwards. And so what I'm going to do is more of a demonstration and a talk, and I'll cast a little type, and then I hope we can have a spirited typecasting afterwards. I'll just ask for you to come up if you'd like to and try your hand at casting type, and we can have a discussion.
Let me interrupt just a moment to say that after the lecture, in addition to the other wonderful things, we plan to serve dessert and have coffee and tea.
That's good.
Yeah. Make sure you get on that.
Just caution everybody when you do come up, be careful of the cords. I don't want to dump hot liquid lead all over everybody. So,
Ready for warfare.
when Mr. Johnson contacted me, we talked on the phone initially. Actually, we talked last year, I think, and then when we talked, I wasn't able to fit this into my schedule. But this year, when we talked, we were having a nice conversation, and then he said something that really scared the hell out of me. He referred to me in the conversation as an expert. And I know a little bit about a lot of things. I'm very wary of that word expert when it's applied to certain people, and particularly when it's applied to me. But I will say I can't claim to be an expert, but I have had the privilege of sitting at the feet of some experts, particularly through the University of Virginia's Rare Book School. Paul Needham, who is a scholar affiliated with Princeton University. I'll mention him later on in the lecture. A brilliant man whose specialty is early printed books. Barbara Shaler, who is the manuscripts curator, or was the manuscripts curator at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. James Mosley, who's a type expert. I've taken several classes from him. And finally, a man named Stan Nelson. And Stan Nelson was a print collections curator. He's retired now, but he was print collections curator at the Smithsonian for many years. And he's also an artisan who's very interested in recreating the technology of the early movable type printing. And some of the objects I have up here tonight, this replica 18th century type mold, with a matrix and a punch, a nice punch with a capital P, and another matrix. This little casting ladle we'll be using later. These were all built by Stan Nelson, and I've had the privilege of watching him work. He's also been a great person for sharing information, particularly via email. We've had a correspondence at times. At any rate, I think as a starting point, I was talking with the gentleman in the back earlier about linotype printing. And I think as a starting point, it's really important for us to realize, and this is something that's obvious, but we don't think about it very often, and that is that the technology, first of all, that we'll be using today is obsolete. There are only a handful of people in the world that are still cutting punches, that are true type cutters, or who are casting type that will actually be used in some sort of press. And again, we have to remember, and again, this seems obvious, but we have to remember that books are not printed anymore. For the lion's share of 99.9% of all books that are produced, unless they're produced at an artisan press, at no time during the production of a modern book do you have an inked bed of type that you press a piece of paper on to make an impression. That's just not done anymore. So we are talking about an obsolete technology. You have to remember that the books are no longer printed. When we talk about the production of metal type in the West, we have to start, of course, with Gutenberg, who was the first person to perfect a workable system for printing books using individual pieces of metal type. And probably when that invention was perfected, probably around 1453, 1454 in Mainz. We have to remember, of course, I tell students, Gutenberg didn't wake up one morning, of course, and spend a couple of days working on this. This was at least a decade-long process, probably started in Strasbourg. So it took him a long time, but he is credited with really perfecting and making the first workable system. There are others, there may have been others who were working on similar systems. The name you hear very often, Laurens Janzoen Koster, who was a Dutchman who sort of emerges out of this sort of shadowy, mysterious world of Dutch prototypography, early Dutch printing. There was a Bohemian man named Procopius Waldvogel, wonderful name. Procopius Waldvogel was working in Avignon. There is some record that he was trying to develop some sort of a type system for producing books. And these rival claimants, back in the early part of the last century, there was discussion about, well, maybe Gutenberg didn't come up with this system. And really, those rival claimants were sort of considered. The scholarship is pretty much settled. I think it's safe to say now that Gutenberg was the first man who created, again, a workable system of printing using movable type and a press. It's important to realize, many of you probably heard about Asian precursors, that there was the Asian cultures were using either ceramic type, brass letters, brass characters, and doing some sort of book production using those. Strictly speaking, although I don't want to denigrate that contribution, but strictly speaking, that's not printing. Because the way that book production worked, you were actually taking rubbings. They weren't actually using a press. So the system of type production that emerged was one in which a metal punch was cut by hand. And as I'll pass this around in a bit, when you look at it, you have to remember this is not machined. This was all done by hand, as was the matrices that I'll pass around. So the system that emerges is a system where a metal punch letter form, is cut by hand, and is used to make an impression in, let me step out and sort of give you at least a quick look. So a little metal punch is produced that is used to make a strike into a little copper bar. Okay? So a punch making a strike into what's called the matrix. Okay. And then I'll pass it around. You can handle it a little bit later. So. And then this little copper bar that is known as the matrix, plural matrices, is actually put into a hand mold, and you pour liquid lead into that mold, and you start producing copper type. And this is some type, just pass these around. You'll be seeing plenty of this. Just start passing these around. This is raw type, lead type, sorry, copper. Lead type that is produced, has been produced in this mold. And as you look at this, you'll see you've got a piece of type, and then you have this little tail on it. That's called a jet. And that, when the type is dressed, it'll be broken off and tossed back in the pot. And only the top part, the rectangular piece of the letter, will actually be used in the press. So of course these pieces of type would then be arranged in some sort of a frame and some sort of a furniture arrangement to make a bed of type. It'd be inked up, put in the bed of a press, and a piece of paper essentially is pushed down on top of it. Now, for centuries, it was believed that Gutenberg had invented this particular method of producing type. In the last 20 years, though, there has been a scholarly argument, one that's been pushed by the man I mentioned earlier, Paul Needham. There's been the scholarly argument that Gutenberg was actually using a sand casting technique to create this type. And initially that theory was discounted in a lot of quarters. Sand casting small pieces of type is very difficult. There have been people that have tried to replicate it modern times. It's very difficult. It's quite tedious. It's problematic in a number of ways. It's very difficult to establish height to paper when you're creating type using that method. But the sand casting method, it was dismissed pretty handily initially, has been given some credence in recent years. But I don't believe there's really a definitive answer to that yet. That theory aside, and I don't want to go too far down that path. That theory aside, we know that definitively by 1470, the system that I'll be describing here tonight, that system was in place. So we have documented evidence that punches were being cut and matrices being used to cast type by about 1470. And this was a technology that was used, it really started being replaced with more modern methods of printing around a little before 1800. But it was still used in a lot of venues through the 19th century and even up in some places through the 20th century. And today, again, it only really survives in artisan presses. Well, let's talk about the process. To begin with, the type cutter, of course, had to have an alphabet, had to have a character set to work with. And that character set had to be drawn out, obviously, on paper in some way. In some cases, particularly in the early days, the type cutter would draw that out. A lot of type cutters were artist in a lot of fields, through a lot of mediums. The character set would be drawn out in paper, sometimes by an artist that the type cutter would hire. And once they had a character set that they were happy with, they would start to cut punches using the characters in this set as a model. Now remember, the punch is a mirror image. It's a wrong reading image of the letter. You have that, and then when you make your matrix, you have a right reading. You have a right reading letter, and then when you cast type, it's wrong reading. But when you print from it, of course, it's right reading. It goes back and forth. In some cases, what the type cutter would do, the artist would do for the type cutter, would be to draw the characters, a mirror image of the characters that they could use as a model. An easier way, and this is what I've seen Stan Nelson do when he cuts punches, is to have the letter form that you're working on set up, and then you put a mirror in front of it, and you just work from the mirror image, using that mirror image as a guide. Well, let's talk about the actual cutting of the punch. And again, this punch was cut by hand by Mr. Nelson. I've watched him up at Rare Book School. Was he there when you were there? Yeah. I've actually watched him cut a punch over the space of several hours. Really, he can generally cut a punch in about 4 or 5 hours and be pretty much finished with it. Starting with just a blank of steel. And while cutting an individual punch is certainly difficult, is certainly challenging, I dare say that probably a lot of us in this room could do it reasonably well after a couple of tries, with some guidance, with somebody who knew what they were doing, sort of guiding you. It's again, it's difficult, but it's not that difficult if you have guidance to cut a single punch. Now, that being said, cutting a set of punches that will produce type that looks like it belongs to a coherent, consistent letter form with a consistent weight to the characters, to the typeface, is quite difficult, and that's something that takes an artisan's skills of a very, very high order. To begin with, the type cutter would just take a metal bar. If you can just imagine, I've drawn one out of size here, just a metal bar. I think very early on, they were using some sort of iron, really, but usually a little later on, a steel bar. The bar would be cut to a uniform size, and it had to be squared off on at least 2 sides, because very often in this process it has to go into a square jig, and you have to make sure everything's squared up. So it'd be squared up on at least 2 sides, and then the bottom of it would be sort of chamfered a bit, would be rounded a bit, because that's the side you're actually going to strike with a hammer. And the face at the top would be very, very finely flattened and squared off, and then very finely polished. And the way it would be polished often is you put it in a little jig and run it on essentially a blackboard, a piece of slate with a little oil, to give it a very, very fine polish. And at this point, the man or the woman, and there were certainly women who were cutting type, would usually cut a signature line, just a little cut into the punch. And when I pass this around later, you'll see there's just a little cut in the side, and that essentially is to indicate where the bottom of the punch is, the bottom of the letter form. And you had to do this because, particularly if you're cutting a lot of punches or striking matrices, it's really difficult to get B's and D's confused, that sort of thing. And so P's, you can get all turned around if you're not careful. So that indicated to you where the bottom of the letter the bottom of the letter was. And then essentially the punch cutter, the type cutter, would take an engraver's needle, an etcher's needle, and mark out the letter form on the face, that flattened, polished face. Just scratch it in until they were happy with the form. And again, if they weren't happy, they could kind of basically sand it down again, grind it down again very finely, and start over again. And what the type cutter had to do too was they would use a little tool. And I know some of you can't see the board here, so I'll just sort of describe it. They'd use a little tool for each set of type that they would cut, and it's something called a face gauge, and it was just a little piece of brass, and they would determine the size of their letter form. Okay? And instead of, when you're making, if you're cutting a set of punches, you don't want to keep going back to your ruler and saying, well, I said this was going to be such and such, 1/18 of an inch high. I don't want to go back and measure that. It's much easier just to use a gauge, just to cut a gauge for the correct height of the letter, and just use that. Check the size of your letter occasionally. And very often they would cut two of these face gauges. They would use one for minuscule letters, for lowercase letters, and those would be a uniform size. And then they would use another that would be used for majuscule or uppercase letters, like a capital P, say, or if you had a lowercase letter with an ascender, with a little, like a B that has a line coming up, or a P that has a line coming down, a descender. Usually that, if you look at a typeface in a book, usually that is the same size if you measure it as a capital letter. So, but at any rate, they would use this face gauge, and they're constantly checking to make sure that character that they've drawn on that steel blank is the correct size. And once they have the letter engraved on there, just scratched on there the way they want it, they can begin to strip away metal. And as you saw here, what they start to do is pull away metal until they have that letter raised in relief. Now, a letter like, again, the P is a good example. A letter like P or B and O, anything that has white space in it, a void, whatever you want to call it, a counter is the term for it, an open area. The type cutter could, if he or she wanted to, spend time digging that out with a little knife. They're using these fine little tools, very sharp little, scorpers, gravers, little knives, files, this sort of thing. They could cut that out if they wanted to. It was usually much easier to make what was called a counterpunch. And a counterpunch would just be a smaller version of this punch, and all you would use that for, you just shape it in the size of whatever void you wanted created, and then you would put your punch into a jig and very carefully take that counter punch and hit it and push metal out. Instead of scraping metal out, what you're doing is displacing metal. You're just making a depression there to create that counter, that open area. Okay. Now when you do that, we'll talk about this with matrices too, you tend to displace metal and it bulges out, so then you'd have to, again, file it down and then probably redraw the character again. And then you would always if you're going to do a counterpunch, you did that first before you began to start stripping away the metal to make your punch. Okay. Well, when the punch was completed, I love it, y'all. You can't find sulfur tip matches anywhere now, and there's a big box of them. I'm probably going to steal them and take them home and let my 10-year-old play with them. here. Use the back
Well
of my
used.
pants.
Keep going.
They're
Here's a
not,
better
not really high-grade matches.
Oh darn! I'm so disappointed. Okay, there we go. Okay, I want to light it with my thumbnail, and I'm afraid it gets sulfur under my nail here. Once the type cutter and our lead's getting nice and liquid now, so that's good. Once the type cutter was happy with the way the punch looked, what he or she would do would be to take the punch and do what was called a smoke proof. And usually they would use an oil lamp or something. I mean, they would use a candle here, which should give us some soot. But what they do is they take that punch and sort of put it in the flame and get some soot built up on the end. And then they actually use a jig. It wouldn't be done by hand like this. But they press it down onto a piece of paper. No, I didn't get a very good one. I'm not getting enough soot here. Need to get some wax on there. At any rate, if they got enough soot on there, they press it down. There, I got a little bit. And they get, I know it's hard for y'all to see back there, but they would just check what the letter looked like on paper. Just pass that around. To sort of check what it looked like, and then if they saw problems, what they could do would be to clean it up and go and try to make some modifications on it. And once they were really happy with it, though, once the type cutter was really happy with it, though, they would, essentially they had to temper it. They'd heat it up and then quench it very quickly because, of course, you're going to be hammering on it and you want it to be nice and solid, not split on you or anything like that. So once it was heat tempered, they were ready to start trying to strike a matrix. And before we talk about striking the matrix, I want to talk a bit about stereotypical qualities of punch cutters, of type cutters. This was obviously very, very exacting work, particularly if the punch cutter was working with a 4-point font. What some people called a diamond font. This very small font. I'm sure we have books in our collection at Drury, and David, I'm sure you all have the books from, say, the 16th century, 15th century that had this tiny little font in it, and you have to remember, by golly, somebody cut a punch to make that. A 4-point font, a single font, the point rather, would be 1/72 of an inch. So a 4-point font is a letter that is 1/18 of an inch high, very, very tiny text. And again, this sort of work demanded not only artisan skills of a very high order, it demanded tremendous concentration. And you have this image of punch cutters or type cutters working in a room by themselves. Very often they're looking through a loupe, by the way. They're using some sort of glass, but they don't want to be disturbed. And such exacting work, and perhaps that's why there are stories that are handed down about type cutters, punch cutters, being extremely temperamental and cranky. To say the least. There's the story of Francesco Grifo. Francesco Grifo was a type cutter who was originally from Bologna, and he found work in the printing house of Aldus Manutius, very well-known printer in Venice, and worked there for a while. He's probably best known because he cut the first set of italics. And I'm going to pass this around. Y'all know how to handle books. You don't baby a book. It's all right. It's not going to fall apart. This is a Aldine piece from 1533. If you can it's okay. If you can just sort of cradle it in your left hand, or if you're left-handed, you can cradle it in your right hand. But I'm going to go ahead and pass this around. Just be careful with it. But I want you to look. This book is all in italics, and it's also a pretty small. I don't think this is a 4-point font, but it's a pretty small. It's a pretty small font here, and the italic. This is the italic that Francesco Grifo first cut. We have to remember that the italic is not just a beautiful letter form. I mean, it was praised when it first appeared. Oh, this is a wonderful letter form. It's also it has a very practical aspect to it. It allows you to compress text. You can sort of turn it and compress it a bit, and this meant that it was possible to fit more words on the page, fit more text on the page, and for the Aldine press to sort of shrink the formats of the book somewhat. The Aldine press is known for producing these books that have this particular shape, which was an innovation at the time. Italics were also used very early on to, in some cases, to indicate quotation. You still see this in Faulkner, but very early on, 16th century, I think there was I want to say a printer in Geneva or Zurich that used that innovation to indicate actual dialogue. At any rate, Grifo invents this. Apparently later, though, Grifo and Aldus Manutius quarreled. There's one tradition that says that Grifo was very upset because he felt that Aldus was sort of taking the credit for his invention of the italic. And so they quarreled, and Grifo left the Aldine shop, the Aldine Academy, went back to Bologna and opens up his own shop. And a couple of years later, in 1516, he's working in the shop. His son-in-law is working with him. They get into some sort of altercation, and Grifo picks up an iron bar. Some people say it was an unfinished punch. It had to be a pretty large punch. And you could make a nice big punch too. But picked up an iron bar and struck his son-in-law in the head and killed him. And that's the last mention we have of him. We know there was a trial. We don't know the outcome of that trial. But we never hear anything about Grifo after that.
The inventor of the italic.
Right. He disappears. Much later,
Probably into a Dutch.
there's a story that's been passed down about an Englishman named Jackson who was an apprentice in the shop of William Caslin. And of course, that's a name that's familiar to people who know about type and books. A very well-known type cutter. And Jackson apparently would, he's an apprentice. He's supposed to be learning, and he would, at every chance, he would watch Caslin at work cutting punches and studied this work. And so finally, Jackson, and again, he would have been a teenager at the time, Jackson feels that he's learned enough just by observing Caslin. Caslin hasn't actually taught him anything. He's just been watching him work. And so in his spare time, Jackson gets a little metal blank and begins to work, and he cuts a punch. And he goes to Caslin. He makes the mistake of going to Caslin and saying, "Hey, boss, look what I made here." And Caslin flies into a rage and begins to slap him about, knocks him down. And that's the thanks he gets for showing the boss what he's done. Presumably because he was stepping out of his station or out of some sort of professional jealousy. And then finally, some of you probably heard of what are known as the fell types. Just a set of matrices and punches to create type that was commissioned by John Fell, who was the Bishop of Oxford, mid to late 17th century, and those punches and the type that came out of that really became the basis for the first real practical Oxford University Press, or University Press of Oxford. Those punches, the fell types, the punches and the matrices were produced by a German named Peter de Waldpergen. And we have a very good record of de Waldpergen because he was constantly being arrested for drunkenness, disorderly conduct, lewd language, and assault. So, you know, I'm sure there were punch cutters that were very calm, serene people. And I know it's unfair to indulge in stereotypes, but maybe it's useful to remember that there are reasons for stereotypes. Well, the next step would be to actually strike a matrix, and matrix, and then the plural matrices.
He is the teacher.
Got to get it right. What the type cutter would do would be to take the punch, put it into a little jig, essentially a little squared jig, and put a copper bar underneath it, and make a series of hammer blows, and again impress that letter into this little copper bar. And in this process, again, you're not cutting metal away. And by the way, people often say, well, why didn't they just use these little scrapers and everything to cut out a letter instead of making a punch? It's almost impossible to do that uniformly, to get a uniform depth if you try to do it that way. And by the way, the signature line that was put on the punch also served as a measurement, sort of a gauge. You could tell how far your strike was going in. They would use that, they could watch that, and have a line on the little jig, and sort of when they were equal, they knew that their strike was deep enough. But at any rate, again, what you're doing when you make a punch, when you're striking it, is you're displacing metal. I'm going to pass this, and this is a partially formed punch. It's matrix rather. And you can see, if you feel it, on either side of the letter there's metal bulging out here because you've displaced the metal. And that would have to be basically scraped away, filed away. And so after the strike was made, and if it was the correct depth and the type cutter was happy with it, what they would do is file that metal away. In some cases, if they didn't quite do the strike right, if it wasn't squared, what they would have to do is something called botching. We've all heard of a botched job. Oh, he botched that. That surgeon botched that. I hope we don't hear that. But that's where the term comes from. And botching, again, in some cases, if the strike wasn't done correctly, what the type cutter would have to do would be to turn that matrix on its side, put it in a vise, and you would take a chisel. You take a little chisel and sort of hit a series of blows on the side to displace metal inward, to try to correct whatever sort of malformed area. And this is apparently very common on matrices. You'll see what are called botching marks if you look at a set of matrices.